Greetings. This is David Bernstein, President and CEO of Jewish Council for Public Affairs. Welcome to this special webinar we are doing on the Israeli elections, the third in under a year. And we're going to get right into it. We have with us one of the finest minds on Israeli politics, Israeli policy, somebody we've relied on a great deal at JCPA and our Community Relations Network. Haviv Redigor. Haviv, it's great to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, Haviv is an Israeli journalist. He's with the Times of Israel. He's a terrific analyst. He was also director of communications at the Jewish Agency, and before that at the Jerusalem Post. Haviv also told me that he served as a bodyguard to Natan Sharansky, and then later his spokesperson. So that's quite a leap. Haviv, we're really glad to have you. And have a lot on our minds, obviously, not just about the elections, but about the broader world, and the elections certainly make it even more complicated. So we just want to get a sense of what happened here in these elections.
Hi, David. Hello to everybody. You know, if I knew what happened in these elections, I'd be a much happier person who has slept a lot more over the last 48 hours. We are all trying to figure out what just happened. The numbers we know. I am going to see if I have figured out how to do this correctly and just load up the preliminary results we have. Does everybody see? Do you see that, David?
Yes.
Okay, so here, 1 second. There it is. Preliminary results show that Likud has expanded. It's now at 36 seats, blue and white. It might be a little higher, a little lower. This is 90% of the votes counted. Now we are already at 99% of the votes counted. There hasn't been dramatic shifts from what you see on the screen here, and every single seat is important because it looks like Netanyahu is just short, by the skin of his teeth of an easy majority coalition. So the details do matter. But this gives us a sense. Likud pulled ahead of blue and white. In September, they were behind blue and white, both in votes and in seats. The Arab Joint List at 15, possibly 16, is the highest turnout we've ever seen for Israel's Arab community in numbers, in percentages, you name it, and the highest Knesset representation. Shas is doing well. United Torah Judaism slipped a little. The Labor Gesher Meretz is the Israeli left. They united and lost about a third of their supporters. So unity on the left was not a wise move for them. Israel Beitenu, the party of Avigdor Lieberman, the party that used to be very easy right-wing gain for Netanyahu and has since pulled away from him and refused to join his coalition and left him short for 2 elections in a row. And it looks like also this one. And then the right-wing Yamina party, which very much backs Netanyahu, but also is very angry at Likud because they ran a campaign that pulled votes from them. So that's what the Knesset looks like. Again, give or take a couple of seats, and those couple of seats could change everything. So that's as far as we know, and now the question becomes, what do you do with that? And there are these very interesting scenarios that we could talk about.
Yeah, we're going to get into that in a second. I want to invite people to ask questions in the question box. You could, and we will monitor and get to as many as we possibly can. So why don't you start? What changed, Haviv, in this election from the previous 2 elections, or at least from the last one?
I think we saw a couple of things. One, we saw real exhaustion. Real profound exhaustion by voters. Voters don't want it. We actually have a spike in turnout, and the spike in turnout the rise in turnout came in two major parties. One was the Arab parties. We saw a huge run on the polls in the Arab community, and by the way, in every part of the Arab community, in the sort of highbrow intellectual elites of Haifa, in the Islamist South and the Bedouin communities, the semi-nomadic Bedouin communities that are polar opposites in terms of that culture from the Haifa intellectuals, in the Christian Arab community, every part of the Arab community, which is a very diverse community, turned out in higher numbers. And that's very interesting and continues the trend of September. And the other run on the polls was Likud. Voters who did not vote in the last election came out to vote for Likud. And even more interesting, Likud actually managed to siphon off not only blue and white voters, not many, half a Knesset seat or so, but enough to turn some of the tide. It actually drew from the real left, from the Labor Meretz party, the Labor Meretz Alliance. And it looks like, again, we haven't done enough real solid, deep sort of surveys and research into this, but at first glance, it looks like a lot of Israelis were just so sick of the elections that when they came to the voting booth, they said, who is the closest to win? Let's just put him over the top. And so you have very left-wing voters voting Netanyahu, is something we saw. So it was a very strange result on Monday, and a very good one for Netanyahu, with the caveat that he doesn't yet have a majority.
Is there any scenario in which Gantz could actually pull ahead and be able to form a coalition?
Yes, I'm going to share my screen again. I just put together please forgive me, everybody. This is a simple, there we go, a simple notepad. I hope that is okay. I hope everyone sees that. A simple notepad with the things you need to know, scenarios. And it's important for you to see this text because it's much easier to see than to describe. These are some of the relevant dates. We'll know whether Netanyahu is the next prime minister by April 28th for sure. By law, he can't go beyond that. And many things can happen before, and then it could be Gantz, and Gantz could then sign a rotation agreement well into May. So this doesn't mean the election ends on April 28th, but April 28th is Netanyahu's current deadline for forming a coalition, assuming he gets an extension and assuming he's the first picked and all of that. That's just a general calendar issue. There are essentially three scenarios. The first scenario is that Netanyahu wins. Likud, Yamina, Shas, and United Torah Judaism, the Haredi right-wing coalition that has vowed to go with him and that he has asked voters to give 61 seats so that he doesn't have to go through any of this again, if they get over 61. Now, they're polling 2 seats away from that at the moment, but we have votes to count from soldiers, which actually lean either left or Yamina, the religious Zionists. And so in the past, and so we might see another seat or two go into there from soldiers. And there's some other smaller, there's some areas that have to be recounted and things like that. That might happen. A more likely scenario is what I call Lieberman wins, Avigdor Lieberman of the Israel Beitenu party. And that's the second scenario, in which the Netanyahu-led coalition has 59. It can't put together a government. Benny Gantz has his 33. The Arab Joint List has, let's say, I'm giving them an extra seat, 16. Labor, let's give Labor whatever, 6. Let's give Avigdor Lieberman is polling at 6 and 7, okay? But even if he's bumped down to 4, Netanyahu's only majority, only hope for passing the 2 votes he needs to pass every 6 months or so, which is a budget vote and a no confidence vote in order to survive and be prime minister, his only hope is to get Avigdor Lieberman to vote with him. Avigdor Lieberman made 2 promises last night. The first promise, I am not sitting in a coalition with Netanyahu and the ultra-Orthodox. And the second promise, there's not going to be a 4th election. Nobody really knows if Netanyahu is 59, how you can neither not sit in the coalition and also not go to a 4th election.
He also pledged not to sit with the Arab list as well, right?
And he won't sit with the Arab list. So it doesn't look like anybody has a majority given these numbers. Now, here's the idea in which Avigdor Lieberman, what he may be shooting for, and I know Likud is worried about him doing this. What if Avigdor Lieberman says, Netanyahu, listen, I will vote for you to establish your minority coalition with 59 seats. And then every time you need to pass a vote to survive, you have to come to me and ask. And so I sit on the side. I'm your survival, right, as you rule this country. You need a budget, you have to have my vote. Well, it better be a budget I support. I'm not in the coalition. I don't have a ministership. I don't have a committee chairmanship. I don't have anything. But you can't do anything without my votes. If he does that, it's a kind of Avigdor Lieberman, it's a minority Netanyahu coalition with the support from outside of Avigdor Lieberman. He's not the prime minister de facto, but he has a veto on just about everything. And he can argue that he that way can prevent major policies that the ultra-Orthodox parties want from going through. His supporters are secularists. They want him to oppose the ultra-Orthodox, and he fulfills all of his promises. So that is the scenario that's looking increasingly likely, assuming Netanyahu has 59 and not 61. Lieberman is the de facto prime minister of Israel. And then there's a scenario in which Gantz wins. This is far-fetched. It's worth mentioning because it gives us a sense of how confusing and how complex. Israel has maybe the simplest electoral system in the world. It's a single constituency, the entire country. We all vote for a party. There's only one thing we actually vote on, in the ballot box. We don't have, all this long list of names and things to check. But then the coalition negotiations enter into it, and then it becomes this chaos map. Gantz could win if something along these lines happened. Netanyahu tries in those 28 plus 14 days extension if Rivlin gives him the extension to form a government, and he fails, as he did in April and September. Gantz gets the second bid, which is reasonable. Parties that now face a fourth election, knowing voters have already punished them and will likely punish them again, like Labor, Gesher, Meretz. Also parties that are not that badly punished, but fear being punished by voters, by low turnout, by disgust. And I think that's Labor, I think that's Israel B'Tselem, and I think that's Shas. They'll get desperate. And then they will agree to go with Gantz to a minority government run by Gantz, in which the government can't get much done on domestic issues because both Lieberman and the ultra-Orthodox will have veto, essentially. The Arabs will have veto, but it's a government that can get a great deal done on the issues that Gantz himself cares about. It can invest in education, it can run a Gaza policy, it can run an Iran policy. That minority government, once it's established, a prime minister has a lot to give out, defense ministries and whatnot. And then he might hope to pull things back together. So there is a scenario, and again, 11 things all have to line up for this to happen, but this kind of thing has happened in the past in Israeli history. There is a scenario in which Gantz wins.
Got it. So
I hope everyone is confused.
Of these elections was Netanyahu's being indicted. And I know that there was a lawsuit that tried to prevent him from running that the Supreme Court in Israel took a pass on, but now those lawsuits are going to be renewed now that the elections have happened. What do you think are the likelihood that that could affect the elections as well?
The plain letter of the law says that a prime minister cannot serve if he is convicted in the last court in the last appeal. So if he loses, he's right now going to trial on March 17 in the Jerusalem District Court. He'll have one appeal to the Supreme Court. It could be a 1.5-year trial. I mean, the 2 appeals, etc. It could take a while. And if he loses the final appeal by law, he can no longer be prime minister. The appeals now are asking the High Court of Justice to apply a standard that they applied earlier in the 90s, really, beginning in the 90s, to ministers who are not the prime minister, that if they have indictments outstanding against them, they can't serve in the position while the indictments are outstanding. And that has been held up by courts, and the Knesset itself hasn't passed a law to change that in the last 25 years. But the appeals are asking the court to extend it to a prime minister, which is usually a little bit more protected by law than, has a little bit more immunity under law than regular cabinet ministers. I am going to just hazard a guess here. The Supreme Court feels a little bit under siege. The right-wing government that just won, certainly if Netanyahu is prime minister, it'll be a very right-wing government, wants to limit its powers, wants to pass laws weakening it and giving the Knesset easier supersession over its decisions. I think the Supreme Court will be very delicate and be very careful not to appear after a Netanyahu election victory, assuming he wins, to have then robbed him of that victory by extending a not necessarily legally mandatory provision to his position. So my sense is the Supreme Court is not going to not let him. But we have these nonprofits, these NGOs that are clean government NGOs, and they're very upset. He does face three separate cases of corruption, one of them for bribery, which is a very serious charge. And they're going to go. They're going to have their day in court. I think we should expect the court to be very conservative.
So if he gets convicted while he's in office, what happens to him? Does he actually have to step down? Does another minister take over? How would that work?
When a prime minister steps down, the Knesset has the option of either appointing a new prime minister in a new coalition, a majority of the Knesset has to then vote for a new government, or we go to elections. A prime minister falling, when prime ministers have fallen before their election day, about half the time in Israel's history, the Knesset managed to cobble together a new government. And about half the time, by the way, fallen means they've lost no confidence. Well, fallen means Ariel Sharon having a stroke in December 2005. Falling means, being assassinated in the case of Rabin, resigning in the case of Golda in 1974. Anything that removes a prime minister, half the time it has sent the country to a new government. The Knesset managed to piece it together, and half the time we've gone to election. So 50-50.
Got it. So the president of Israel, Ruby Rivlin, talked about these elections being almost uniquely ugly. And there were all kinds of intrigue going on. The latest I heard was a blue and white member who's being blackmailed to switch sides to the Likud bloc, lest some very private information be released. What do you, and I know that there were other accusations made against Gantz himself during these elections. What happened here that really made Rivlin comment the way he did?
I share Rivlin's concern. I think most Israelis do. This was maybe the ugliest election we have ever seen. And what makes it even worse is that it was a conscious, calculated decision to make this a very ugly election. Essentially, what has happened is we have begun to see in Israeli politics, and not only in Israeli politics, this is happening a little bit in the United States, and more even in the United States and in Europe, but we've begun to see some social psychology, some real science being brought to bear in the campaigns. And one of the things, for example, that social science tells us that this merger of the humanities and neurology tell us is that you cannot, for example, not imagine a pink elephant if someone tells you not to imagine a pink elephant. And the reason you can't not imagine a pink elephant if I tell you stop, don't, whatever you do, don't imagine a pink elephant, is that your mind actually holds an image of the thing to compare to your other thoughts so that it can be sure you're not thinking those thoughts. So in order not to imagine a pink elephant, you have to constantly be comparing every other thing you're imagining to that pink elephant, and therefore must imagine a pink elephant. That is a mechanism in the brain. It's been very heavily researched and discussed and studied by various kinds of scientists in an interdisciplinary way. And what it means is that if I were to tell you that I am about to tell you a complete fiction, a complete lie, I am literally telling you a lie. I have a friend named Bob, and my friend has raped a young woman. And I am telling you now that I just lied to you. It doesn't matter, because next time you meet Bob, by the way is a fictional person, next time you meet Bob, you will not be able to not think about the thing I just lied to you about, and that's even though I have told you while telling you that thing about that it's a lie. Benjamin Netanyahu during this election campaign told Israelis, in his own words, from his own mouth, the Prime Minister of Israel on national television, that and his son has tweeted it, and this has gone out from the campaign in 100 different ways, that there are apparently sex videos of Gantz on his phone having to do with him cheating on his wife in various ways that were hacked from his phone and are now in the hands of Iranian intelligence. And therefore they can extort him. Nobody outside of exactly 2 organizations seems to be able to get their hands on these sex videos. And those 2 organizations are Likud's campaign and Iranian intelligence. It's not true. It's a lie. These are lies. And when confronted by a reporter just literally 2 days ago, you say these things that are just flat out lies and you know they're lies, then Netanyahu literally responded, let them deny it. I don't have to deny it for them. And Likud's coalition chairman, last coalition chairman, Miki Zohar, who's a member of Knesset Likud, was asked about this on election day by a reporter, and he said, politics is for big boys. Politics is hard. And if you're insulted and offended by these things, you probably don't have the stomach for politics. So Likud has been defending this way of doing business, this way of managing campaigns. these efforts essentially to hack the human brainstem. The human brainstem can be hacked just by talking to it. That is a very valuable fact for the campaign. And people like me and people like Rivlin, and I think a lot of Israelis, and incidentally, I have spoken to more than a dozen Likud people, senior, important Likud people, campaign people in Likud, who are deeply, deeply uncomfortable with this new direction. I gave you an example of one or two of these claims and pretended arguments and these fake news things that Likud has produced, but it was the entire campaign. There was very little else in the campaign other than these kinds of tricks. At least in the Israeli news cycle. Netanyahu, the Trump peace plan, Netanyahu went to Uganda and met a Sudanese leader and brought back an Israeli from a Russian prison. And there were all these things. They did not move the poll numbers. What moved the poll numbers was the claim that Benny Gantz had some sex video that, in the hands of Iranian intelligence, even though none of the rest of us can find it.
Right, but what about some of the other issues that intervened during the election, like the Trump peace plan? I mean, there were a lot of other global interventions that might have changed the dynamic. How did that work out?
We have day by day polls, hour by hour polls in some days, and we watched Israelis' responses. The camp that wants Netanyahu is extremely stable, and the camp that doesn't want Netanyahu is extremely stable. And both sides thought of this election as a referendum on him. And I think that the Likud campaign turned to this very, very nasty and vicious campaign just in the last, it really focused on them in the last 2-3 weeks. And it did so, I think, out of desperation, because the Trump peace plan is a spectacular plan for Israel. It is essentially, if you Google the Alon plan, or Benjamin Netanyahu's 2014 negotiating position, or it was Barak's Camp David ideal map in 2000 back with Bill Clinton. It's essentially what Israel's ideal perfect world scenario for Israel is, right? It's Israel's starting point in the negotiation, is essentially the map of the Trump peace plan. And Israelis came with that plan, assuming they would then have to compromise quite a bit and give another 30% of the West Bank, etc. So the Trump peace plan should have really moved the polls. I think Israelis who don't like Netanyahu think that Israel will still be able to get that out of Trump. It wasn't a gift to Netanyahu. And Israelis who do like Netanyahu, we're already there. So none of these things moved the polls. What did move the polls was the beginning of the negative campaign on Gantz. And it got to a point that we have just never seen. We've had real passionate elections, angry elections. We had a debate on the Oslo peace process in the 90s that sent one person to kill the prime minister in 1995. Rabin and Shimon Peres famously hated each other. Ben Gurion and Weizmann. We've had many, many rivalries in Israeli history. The claim that Likud has produced in the last month, we have never seen in an Israeli election, and it came from Netanyahu's own mouth. So that's what Rivlin was talking about, and it also maybe says something important about the only way to weaken Gantz wasn't to give Netanyahu successes, but to start undermining and questioning Gantz's own abilities and character and things like that.
Did the coronavirus play a role at all? Did it affect voter turnout in any way? Did it change the
What do you mean?
Netanyahu's leadership?
Did what?
Did it change the perception of keeping the incumbent leader in power?
What did?
The coronavirus, COVID-19.
Oh, yeah, there was a little bit of worry that people wouldn't go out to vote. We saw an increase almost everywhere. Most places in the country, Israelis completely ignored the corona issue when they went out to the ballot box. Netanyahu handled that, I think, competently. There's a debate in Israel now whether Israel did too much. There are some steps Israel took that are unprecedented. No one else in the world took them. I think some countries wish they had reacted as stridently as Israel did. No, I can tell you from polling numbers, I don't think it moved the voters. He responded competently, and Israelis generally think Netanyahu is competent. But Gantz is also competent. One of the interesting things has been to play back to Netanyahu, as some interviewers have done, just footage of him praising Benny Gantz. He not only appointed Gantz head of the army, He then extended his term in 2015, and then he praised him as one of the better chiefs of staff Israel has had. So that was played to him repeatedly as he's, turned to a campaign arguing that Gantz has dementia and has sex videos and is mentally ill and all of these different things that we've seen from the Likud campaign.
You didn't mention, Haviv, the possibility of a unity government. Is that completely out?
It is not completely out. If you had spoken to me 12 hours ago, I would have said it's the likely scenario. Netanyahu gave a speech last night in which he talked about his victory and how these have been the best 10 years Israel's ever had under his leadership. And then instead of saying we're only going to have a government, with my friends, he actually said it's time for we're going to start there, but it's also time to heal the wounds and come back together and unify as a people again, which was a very interesting message, and one of the few times Netanyahu has said that after an election. And Benny Gantz, again, went to deliver the exact same speech. Everyone expected him to say, we'll never sit with Netanyahu when he's indicted and he's on trial. And he got up and he gave his speech, 3 hours after the polls closed, and he said, we will not stop in Parliament his legal proceedings. Legal proceedings are sorted out in a courtroom. And it's time to unify and heal the wounds, which is fascinating because we weren't asking him if he was going to support immunity for Netanyahu. So he clarified to us that he wasn't going to support immunity for Netanyahu, but he did not say he won't sit with him, which was the big question in the last two elections, right? So both leaders signaled that they might want unity. The cost for Netanyahu, the personal cost, could be very great because then he won't have immunity as he goes to trial. Because the trial begins on March 17, right at the beginning of the negotiation process, it's also possible that Gantz might demand to go first in the rotation agreement of a unity government. And if Netanyahu is exonerated within the 2 years of his term, then Netanyahu gets to be right the next 2 years. Which would make Gantz the winner. You don't win an Israeli election on election day, you win the Israeli election in the negotiations. So would Netanyahu agree to something like that? On the other hand, it might position him well to go to trial. These are very complicated calculations that these men are doing right now, and they themselves don't have the answer. Since then, we've seen something interesting happen, which is that inside Blue and White, Yesh Atid, Yair Lapid's faction, and Telem, Moshe Ya'alon's faction, don't want a unity government. They want to turn Blue and White into a big, serious opposition that prevents Netanyahu from getting anything done and potentially forces him to fall and give them a minority coalition of the kind I described in which Gantz wins. So there's now this very, very intense debate happening inside Blue and White, and I think that further complicates the calculations of Gantz and also the calculations of Bibi. The last thing Bibi wants is to say, let's have a unity government, and then Blue and White spurns him. So there are layers on layers here.
So I've been integrating questions into my questioning of you as we've gone along from our audience, but one of them is about Iran policy and whether or not Israel's policy toward Iran will at all be affected by these elections if the Iranian leadership is not completely ravaged by coronavirus in the meantime. What is your take on that right now? There are several ways to understand Israel's Iran policy. The overarching Israeli strategic posture, which says Iran cannot be allowed to expand further in Lebanon, in Gaza, even in Sinai, and in Syria, and now recently also in Iraq. That posture is unified across the Israeli political spectrum. A prime minister from Meretz will have the same policy and will launch the same airstrikes in Syria that Netanyahu has. There is no part of the army that disagrees with that policy. And one of the architects of that policy, former Deputy Chief of Staff Yair Golan, is actually a member of Knesset. Assuming Labor Meretz get enough seats, will be one of their members of Knesset. So Iran policy in terms of regional expansion is unified, it's just a unanimous. So that won't change in any way. Gantz is one of the architects with Netanyahu of that policy over the last 10 years. What Gantz and Netanyahu have disagreed on, and Netanyahu has really bucked the Mossad until Yossi Cohen became the head of the Mossad. Netanyahu appointed someone who agreed with him, head of the Mossad, on this issue, but until then, the Mossad disagreed with him.
and the army was the question of being very, very aggressive in Europe and being very, very aggressive in Washington, especially in opposition to Barack Obama, going to Congress under Barack Obama's nose, thumbing his nose at the American president in pursuit of undermining the Iran deal, something that Trump has just, given Netanyahu, but which, there's every Republican White House has a Democratic White House after it, right? At some point, if not now, then in 4 years. There are Israelis like Gantz who said the Iran deal, there are three camps in Israel. There's the camp that says the Iran deal wasn't bad. It actually was not bad. It actually delayed Iran, and Iran is an incompetent regime. And if you delay them and you constantly sabotage them, as we know how to do, they will never have the bomb, and you never had to bomb them. And then there are very serious people in that camp in Israel, including heads of Mossad and army who were doing those disruptive policies. And then there's a camp that is Netanyahu's camp that says Iran will get the bomb if the world doesn't choke it essentially to death, the regime, not the country. And therefore, right, and AIPAC sided with them, and therefore the Iran deal is dangerous. And then there was the middle ground, and Gantz was in the middle ground. And the middle ground said the Iran deal is bad. The Iran deal makes our situation more difficult. It is harder for us to now stop the Iranian nuclear program that the world now has allowed hundreds of billions of dollars into the Iranian economy. We now need the Americans more than we needed them the day before the Iran deal because they produced the Iran deal. He agrees with Netanyahu the Iran deal is bad. That made Israel more needy of America. Therefore, don't cut those ties. Don't damage our ties with the United States, with the Democratic White House that we will need down the road to stop the deal. So that was a Gantz. It was, yes, you're right, Netanyahu, and you reacted very, very badly and are therefore wrong. How that plays out if Gantz is prime minister, I don't know. I think the consensus today in Israel is that Netanyahu was right to challenge Obama in that way. I think that's the consensus because of Trump. If Bernie Sanders is the next president, the Israeli consensus will have retroactively not been that. And then everyone will be very hopeful that Gantz is the prime minister to start repairing those ties. So that's where things stand.
Okay. An interesting question here. Is there any sign of foreign interference in the Israeli elections?
We have had no reporting on that, no warnings about it. There was Netanyahu and Gantz have both said that people will try to disrupt the elections, but both of them said it as part of their own get out the vote drive. Don't let the other side disrupt the election. There was a very little bit about from the cyber directorate of the prime minister's office. That's the sort of the cyber defense umbrella body of the Israeli government, which was very worried about this, but also took a lot of very serious steps and a lot of issues that they've been planning for years on how to protect elections. So we saw officials be very worried and careful and take the necessary steps. And there has been no reporting on any. There have been Israeli domestic problems. There was a guy who's now being indicted for stuffing hundreds of ballots into his pockets and thinking he could walk out of the ballot box that way. But we don't have any sign of a foreign intervention. I should just say Israel's voting system has a paper trail. And everything is notes. There are no touch screens. There's no computers. The notes are then put into the computers, but there's always the backup where you can go back and count. They're now going back to recount something like 50 ballot stations out of, I think it was 10,000. So paper trails help solve some of these problems.
So you mentioned that there was greater turnout among the Arab Joint List. Why was that the case? Why was there more people voting, Israeli Arabs voting, and what did it mean for the election, if anything?
I am very proud of this turnout, and I'm very proud of it because I once wrote a piece that predicted it, and one of the members of the Knesset from the Arab parties said that it was racist to argue what I argued, and that turnout would actually drop. And his interest was very much in the old way of doing business. And now I think that the general consensus in the Arab parties and people like Ayman Odeh who agree with what I wrote are on top in Arab politics, and we think that's a very good thing for Israel's Arabs. Essentially, I think what happened was that Arab politics used to be divided into these very, very distinct and very different and very opposed political camps. So you have Ra'am, which is a political party that has the Islamist movement of Israel, the Islamic movement, which is an Islamist ideological institution. Almost all of its voters are Bedouin in the south, very, very conservative society, religiously conservative, and ideologically Islamist in the sense of the rest of the Sunni world, where we find Islamists. And then you have a party like Hadash, which is a social democratic, more socialist maybe, but very socialist, very progressive, very modern, very educated part of Arab society, mostly in the north of Israel. And then you have Balad, which is a very staunch Palestinian nationalist party that keeps saying very mean things that get a lot of Jewish politicians very angry, like Israeli soldiers are terrorists, and all these things. Very, very different. Hadash are deeply integrationist. They want Arabs in the Israeli economy, in Israeli society. They're very offended when someone suggests that Arabs should go to the Palestinian state and Jews should go to the Jewish state, even if it means removing settlements and redrawing lines. They get very offended and think that's very racist. So you have in Arab politics integrationists, you have non-integrationists, you have very religious people, very secular progressive people, and they each had different parties. And I argued back in 2014 that they also have very, very low turnout. Whatever these parties are selling in the Arab street, the Arab community isn't buying. To the average Israeli Arab, the fact that their representatives aren't at the budget table, the fact that their representatives aren't forcing another $1 billion shekels for public transportation and schools in their towns by being in the finance committee of the Knesset matters more to them than whether their representative happens to be Islamist or socialist. And if they're united, they'd be able to do that. And I got this angry response from a member of Knesset from Balad who said, you don't understand, you Jews see us Arabs all as one thing, and you don't realize that I and Balad don't agree with Ra'am Islamists. In 2015, they united and delivered the highest turnout they'd ever had, and 13 seats. In 2019, April, they then split into two ideological parties again and dropped something like 3 seats. And in September, they reunited into a single joint list and ran as Arabs without all the ideological divisions. And their own voters came back out and they regained the 13 seats. And now we saw a Likud campaign against them, targeting them in very ugly ways. Part of the ugliness of this election was also Likud targeting the Arab voters and not just targeting Gantz and the centrists and the left. And they're now at another unprecedented high. So I'm very, very happy about this. Their voice needs to be heard. If we don't invest in them properly, they won't integrate properly, and we lose huge amounts in our economy. It's a better Israel. It's a more moral Israel. And one of the strangest, most interesting things, I personally don't say who I vote for. I think I can safely say I have never voted for the joint list. But I'm very worried about Arab politics being marginalized. Because that's a very bad future for them, and it's a very bad future for us. And Ayman Odeh is someone who is looking for ways to integrate. And some of the people on his list are Balad, who will keep being difficult for him to bring to the table with Jewish politicians. But the trend, the Arab voter has spoken, and the Arab voter has asked to integrate into Israel in a massive way. It, by the way, is probably what keeps Netanyahu from 61. So Gantz owes Ayman Odeh a favor as well. So that's my view on that.
Interesting. So let's just turn the tables for 1 second. There's elections in the United States that are unfolding before our eyes, obviously Democratic primaries. And it seems that Bernie Sanders has sort of pierced the consciousness of many Israelis. Danny Danon at the AIPAC conference, he's Israel's ambassador to the United Nations, made some disparaging comments saying that that Sanders would not really be welcomed in Israel. How is this playing out in the Israeli public?
On the narrow question you asked of the Israeli public itself, I think it's been almost unnoticed. And I think that's because it's election week. The media hasn't really covered it. There's been too much other stuff to do. There's so much anxiety over Netanyahu and Gantz that the Hebrew language press has really missed it. I think it will come back to noticing Sanders as the campaign in America advances and as some of this discourse continues. On the question of why would an Israeli ambassador to the United States speak that way about a potential next president, I think Israel, there's a conscious policy in the Netanyahu government to take full advantage of the Trump moment, and the future partisanship question will be solved in the future. There are too many benefits to be gained from this moment to leave those benefits on the table by worrying about Democrats' feelings. And the other point I would make is Bernie Sanders made some comments about Israel that are very silly. They're silly about Israel. They don't describe Israel. They are words that are thrown into the air as political slogans. Israel is not a political program. Israel is a country. We have 2 million school children. They all have to go to school tomorrow. We speak our own language, spoken nowhere else in the world. We are not a moral emotion that somebody gets to feel, whether we get to live or die. We are a country. You want to deal with, if you have worse feelings about us than you have about any other country in the world, then you're not looking at us, the real people. You're talking about some kind of moral cartoon. So I think Bernie Sanders has managed to, Israelis who do pay attention are insulted. And they're not insulted because he might have said something anti-Israel. We're very used to anti-Israel. They're insulted that he thinks we're some kind of moral cartoon for him to talk to other American progressives about. This hasn't yet broken into the public consciousness in Israel, and I'm sure it will, as the campaign advances.
Got it. So, Haviv, this has been, as always, extremely instructive. I want to recommend that anybody who wants to bring Haviv to their community has an opportunity to do so. You're going to be in the States coming up. When are you going to be in the States?
Right. I'll be a week before Pesach, early April 4 through 6, 7. And then in May, I'll be May 17 in St. Louis for the big conference of the Big Zionism 3.0 event they're having there. And then probably looking at summer trips already, starting to plan them. So I make it quite often. So if anybody's interested, I'd love to come and speak and meet up and have discussions.
Fantastic. Really appreciate it. And we'll look forward to reading some more of your analysis in the coming days as the election, post-election unfolds. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being with us. Until next time.
Thank you, David.